Over 60, top 5 superfoods doctors recommend for strong eyes. Let me start with a bold truth. 99% of people over 60 have no idea that the foods they eat every single day could be the deciding factor between crystal clear vision and a future of blurry, fading eyesight. Most folks think vision loss is just part of getting older. Others believe it's all about stronger glasses or expensive surgeries. But let me tell you something that may shock you, they are wrong. I've spent decades treating seniors, and I've seen the same story play out over and over. A patient comes in terrified that their world is slipping away, convinced there's nothing they can do. And then with the right foods, everything changes. Their vision stabilizes, the glare that blinded them at night fades. They recognize the faces of their grandchildren again, not because of a miracle pill or a risky procedure, but because of what was on their plate. So here's my challenge to you. If you believe it's too late to protect your eyes, I want you to stay with me, because in the next few minutes, I'm going to show you the 5 superfoods that top doctors like me recommend to keep your vision sharp after 60. And I promise, number 3 on this list is something so common, you probably have it in your fridge right now, but you've never realized just how powerful it is. But before we get into it, do me a quick favor. Hit that like button, share this video with someone you care about, and subscribe to the channel. That way we can keep bringing you the kind of real, life-changing health advice you won't hear anywhere else. All right, let's dive in. Because the next few minutes could be the difference between living in a blurry, gray world or keeping your eyesight sharp, vibrant, and full of color for years to come. Why eyes get blurry after 60. Most of us don't think about our eyes until the world around us starts to lose its sharpness. One day you realize the headlines in the morning paper look fuzzy, or the glare from headlights makes you nervous at night. You might even catch yourself holding a book at arm's length just to read a page. The truth is, vision changes after 60 are common, but they are not always just a natural part of aging. First reason is simple biology. As we grow older, the lens inside the eye gradually hardens. In our 20s, it's soft and flexible, easily adjusting to focus on near and far objects. By the time we hit our 60s, that lens stiffens. This condition, called presbyopia, makes close-up vision difficult. At the same time, the retina, the thin layer of tissue at the back of the eye, receives less oxygen and fewer nutrients. It doesn't process light as efficiently, which is why dim restaurants, cloudy afternoons, or night driving can suddenly feel like looking through a fog. According to the National Eye Institute, by age 65, nearly 1 in 3 Americans has some form of vision-reducing eye disease. The second reason is disease itself. Cataracts are one of the most common culprits. The clear lens becomes cloudy, and vision turns hazy, like looking through a frosted window. More than half of Americans over 75 either have cataracts or have had surgery to remove them. Macular degeneration, or AMD, affects central vision, the part you need to read, recognize faces, or drive, and nearly 20 million Americans live with it today. Glaucoma is another threat, known as the silent thief of sight, because it damages the optic nerve slowly, often without symptoms until vision is permanently lost. For those living with diabetes, high blood sugar can damage the fragile blood vessels in the eyes, causing diabetic retinopathy. And then there's chronic dry eye, which becomes more common with age and can be made worse by everyday medications. It doesn't sound serious, but it can blur vision and make life uncomfortable. Lifestyle also plays a major role. A diet lacking antioxidants and omega-3s leaves the eyes vulnerable. Smoking doubles the risk of macular degeneration. Uncontrolled blood pressure or diabetes accelerates damage to the retina. And yes, even in retirement, hours of screen time on the TV or tablet can exhaust already aging eyes. Have you ever finished an evening of television only to find your vision blurred and your eyes stinging? That's not just tiredness, it's your body telling you something. I'll never forget Mrs. Thompson, a 67-year-old retired librarian. She loved reading mysteries, but over the course of a year, the words on the page grew blurrier. Stronger reading glasses didn't help. When I examined her, she showed early signs of macular degeneration. She was devastated, not just because of the diagnosis, but because she feared she would lose the ability to read to her grandchildren. Instead of focusing only on prescriptions, we looked at her lifestyle. We added leafy greens, salmon, and berries, foods rich in the very nutrients her eyes needed. 6 months later, her vision had stabilized. It wasn't perfect, but she still read bedtime stories to her grandkids, which mattered most to her. The good news is that blurry eyes after 60 are not inevitable. Aging changes the eyes, but the rate and severity of that change depend on the choices we make. Nutrition, regular checkups, and healthy habits can slow down vision loss, preserve independence, and keep the world clear and colorful. The question is, what would it mean to you to hold onto sharp vision, to keep reading, driving, and recognizing the faces you love well into your 70s and 80s. The decisions you make today could protect your sight tomorrow. Superfood number 1, leafy greens, the natural eye shield. When it comes to protecting vision after 60, few foods are as valuable as leafy greens. Kale, spinach, collard greens, Swiss chard, even romaine lettuce are far more than side dishes. They're medicine for your eyes. What makes them so powerful are two carotenoids, lutein and zeaxanthin. These nutrients concentrate in the retina, especially the macula, where they act like natural sunglasses. They filter harmful blue light and fight off oxidative stress that slowly damages eye tissue. Without enough of them, the risk of macular degeneration, the leading cause of blindness in seniors, climbs significantly. The evidence is strong. The National Eye Institute's ARDS-2 study found that people who consumed higher levels of lutein and zeaxanthin lowered their risk of progressing to advanced macular degeneration by about 25%. Harvard researchers also showed that women with diets rich in these nutrients had up to a 40% lower risk of cataracts. Numbers like that explain why eye specialists consistently recommend greens as a frontline defense. In my own practice, I've seen this play out many times. One patient, Mr. Alvarez, 72, came in deeply worried. "Doc, I can't recognize faces at the park anymore. Everyone's features look blurred." His diet was heavy on bread, pasta, and red meat, but almost no vegetables. We made a simple shift, spinach with his lunch and a morning smoothie with kale and fruit. 6 months later, his vision hadn't returned to perfect, but it had stabilized. More importantly, he smiled and said, "I can see my grandkids' faces clearly again." For him, that meant everything. The practical part is easy. About 1 cup of cooked kale or 2 cups of raw spinach a day provides the amount of lutein and zeaxanthin most studies recommend. Because these nutrients are fat-soluble, pairing them with healthy fats makes absorption far better. A drizzle of olive oil on a salad, a slice of avocado with spinach, or lightly sautéing greens can turn a simple meal into eye protection. So let me ask you, if something as simple as adding a serving of greens each day could help preserve your ability to read, drive, and recognize the faces you love, isn't that worth it? For many of my patients, the answer is obvious once they see how powerful these everyday foods can be. Leafy greens aren't just about eating healthy. They're about holding on to freedom, independence, and the sharp vision that makes life full of color. Superfood number 2, fatty fish. The omega-3 lifeline for your eyes. If leafy greens act like sunglasses for your eyes, then fatty fish are the oil that keeps the engine running smoothly. Salmon, sardines, mackerel, trout, and even herring are some of the best sources of omega-3 fatty acids, particularly DHA, also known as docosahexaenoic acid. What many people don't realize is that nearly 1/3 of the retina is made of DHA. Without enough of it, the cells in your retina struggle to communicate, and your vision begins to decline more quickly. Omega-3s also reduce inflammation throughout the body and strengthen the oily layer of your tears, which makes them especially important for fighting dry eye syndrome, a condition that troubles so many seniors. The science is clear. A landmark study in JAMA ophthalmology found that older adults who ate fatty fish at least twice a week had a 42% lower risk of developing advanced macular degeneration compared to those who rarely ate it. That's nearly cutting your risk in half by adding fish to your diet. Other studies have shown that people with higher omega-3 levels also have a lower risk of diabetic retinopathy and fewer problems with chronic eye dryness. These numbers aren't just statistics. They represent a very real opportunity to preserve independence and quality of life. I've seen this firsthand with patients like Helen, a 69-year-old retired teacher. She came to me frustrated because her eyes burned and watered every evening. She assumed it was just part of aging. When I reviewed her diet, I noticed she hadn't eaten fish in years. We made a simple adjustment, 2 servings of salmon each week and the occasional can of sardines. 3 months later, she came back smiling, telling me, "Doc, my eyes don't sting anymore and I can finally watch my evening shows in peace." It wasn't medication, it was food making the difference. So how much do you really need? Most doctors recommend at least 2 servings of fatty fish per week, with each serving about the size of your palm. If fish isn't your favorite, plant-based sources like chia seeds, flax seeds, and walnuts can help, though they aren't as efficient at supplying DHA. For those who simply can't tolerate fish, a high-quality omega-3 supplement may be worth discussing with your doctor. And here's a tip I often share. Pair fish with leafy greens for maximum benefit. A grilled salmon fillet on a bed of sautéed spinach with a drizzle of olive oil delivers lutein, zeaxanthin, and DHA all in one plate. 3 of the most powerful nutrients for vision health working together. So let me ask you this. If something as enjoyable as a salmon dinner could help protect your eyes, keep you reading and driving, and let you see your loved ones clearly for years longer, wouldn't you add it to your weekly routine? Omega-3s aren't just a healthy option, they are a lifeline for your eyes. Superfood number 3, berries, the antioxidant army that guards your vision. If leafy greens are the shield and fatty fish are the oil, then berries are the army of tiny soldiers patrolling your eyes day and night, protecting them from damage before it even begins. Blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, and strawberries may look small, but each one carries more power than you'd expect. The secret lies in compounds called anthocyanins, some of the most potent antioxidants found in nature. To understand why they matter, think of oxidative stress as rust forming inside your body. Every day, light exposure, pollution, and even your body's normal metabolism create unstable molecules known as free radicals. Left unchecked, they chip away at delicate tissues in the eyes, leading to conditions like cataracts and macular degeneration. Anthocyanins act like repair crews, neutralizing those free radicals before lasting damage sets in. They also strengthen blood vessels and keep them flexible, which is critical because your eyes depend on a dense network of tiny capillaries to deliver oxygen and nutrients. If those vessels stiffen or leak, vision deteriorates quickly. The science backs this up. A study published in the Journal of Agricultural and Food Chemistry found that blueberry extract improved night vision and increased retinal blood flow in older adults. Another clinical trial in nutrients reported that regular consumption of bilberry, a cousin of the blueberry, helped slow progression of early-stage glaucoma by improving ocular blood circulation. These results suggest that berries don't just taste good, they literally change how well your eyes adapt to light and maintain healthy circulation. I've seen the benefits firsthand. Mr. Jenkins, a 74-year-old retired truck driver, came to me discouraged. "Doc, I can't drive at night anymore," he said. "The glare blinds me and I feel unsafe on the road." Instead of handing him a stronger prescription for glasses, we took a closer look at his diet. He was eating almost no fruit. Together we made a simple change: 1 cup of blueberries stirred into his oatmeal every morning and a handful of blackberries as an evening snack. A few months later he returned and told me, "I still don't love driving at night, but the glare isn't blinding me anymore. I feel safer." That was food, not medicine, making a tangible difference in his quality of life. So how much do you need? Aim for at least half a cup of berries every day. Fresh berries are ideal, but frozen ones work just as well. Just avoid varieties with added sugar. They are versatile. Sprinkle blueberries on cereal, blend raspberries into a smoothie, or simply snack on a handful while watching TV. Consistency is what matters most. Here's something I encourage my patients to think about. Not all berries are created equal, and each type offers a unique set of benefits. Blueberries are especially rich in anthocyanins, strawberries deliver vitamin C, and blackberries provide both fiber and polyphenols. By mixing different colors, you're giving your eyes a broad spectrum of protection. It's like sending in an entire army rather than just one soldier. If you're over 60 and starting to worry about your vision, remember this simple rule: the deeper the color, the deeper the protection. Those dark, vibrant berries aren't just pretty to look at, they are medicine for your eyes. So let me ask you, if a bowl of colorful berries each day could help you hold on to your ability to read, drive, and enjoy the faces of the people you love, wouldn't it be worth making them part of your routine? Superfood number 4, eggs, the complete package for your eyes. This one often surprises people. For years, eggs, especially egg yolks, were treated as villains because of cholesterol. Many seniors were told to avoid them altogether. But modern science has turned that old advice upside down. Eggs are actually one of the most complete and affordable foods for your eyes. The yolk is where the magic happens. It contains lutein and zeaxanthin, the same 2 carotenoids found in leafy greens, but here they come with a natural advantage. Unlike vegetables, where absorption depends on adding fat, eggs already provide these nutrients in a fat-rich package, which makes it much easier for the body to absorb and use them. A study in the Journal of Nutrition showed that eating just 1 egg a day significantly boosted blood levels of lutein and zeaxanthin in older adults, without raising cholesterol in most healthy seniors. Eggs also deliver high-quality protein to support tissue repair, vitamin D to help lower inflammation in the eyes, and choline, a nutrient that supports nerve health, including the optic nerve. I think of Margaret, a 70-year-old retired nurse who came to me concerned about cataracts. Her mother had lost her vision to them, and she was terrified of following the same path. When I asked about her diet, she admitted she had cut eggs out completely because she thought they were bad for the heart. We reintroduced them slowly, 2 or 3 times a week, scrambled with spinach or boiled for breakfast. 6 months later, her lab work showed improved antioxidant levels, and her ophthalmologist noted her cataracts had not progressed. Margaret looked at me and said, "Doc, I wish I had started this earlier." Her story isn't unique. I've seen many patients benefit when they stop fearing eggs and start enjoying them again. For most seniors, 1 egg per day is safe and beneficial. If cholesterol is a concern, it's always wise to check with your doctor. But the latest research shows dietary cholesterol doesn't impact blood cholesterol as much as we once believed. In fact, the 2015-2020 dietary guidelines for Americans no longer set a limit on cholesterol intake from food, a sign of how far the science has shifted. If you want to get the most from eggs, pair them with other eye-friendly foods. A breakfast of scrambled eggs with kale and tomatoes, cooked in a little olive oil, delivers lutein, zeaxanthin, vitamin C, and healthy fats all in one meal. It's simple, satisfying, and far more effective for your eyes than a sugary cereal. So let me ask you, if a food as affordable and versatile as eggs could help protect your vision and slow the march of cataracts, wouldn't it make sense to bring them back to your table? Eggs are not the enemy, they are allies. For seniors who want to keep their independence and enjoy the world in full color, they may be one of the smartest daily choices you can make. Superfood number 5, nuts and seeds, the tiny giants of eye protection. Sometimes the most powerful medicine really does come in the smallest package, and that's exactly the case with nuts and seeds. Almonds, walnuts, chia seeds, flax seeds, and sunflower seeds may look simple, but they are loaded with compounds that directly protect your vision. These foods are some of the richest natural sources of vitamin E, a potent antioxidant that shields eye cells from oxidative stress, the very process that leads to cataracts and age-related macular degeneration. A large study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that seniors with higher vitamin E intake had about a 20% lower risk of developing cataracts compared to those with low intake. That's a significant reduction from something as easy as a handful of nuts. Walnuts, chia seeds, and flax seeds also provide omega-3 fatty acids, which work much like the ones found in fish by protecting the retina and reducing dry eyes. Add in trace minerals like zinc and selenium, both essential for retinal and lens health, and you've got a powerhouse of nutrition in every bite. I think of George, a 75-year-old retired accountant who came to me frustrated by constant eye fatigue. "Doc, after half an hour of reading, my eyes just give up," he told me. When we reviewed his diet, I realized most of his snacks were processed foods like cookies and crackers with almost no nuts or seeds. We made a simple swap, a small handful of almonds in the afternoon and ground flax seeds sprinkled on his morning oatmeal. Within a couple of months, George came back smiling. "I can read for hours again without my eyes burning," he said. The antioxidants had been quietly doing their work, repairing and protecting his eye tissue day by day. So how much do you actually need? Just a small handful, about an ounce a day, is enough. That works out to around 23 almonds, 14 walnut halves, or 2 tablespoons of chia or flaxseed. Nuts are calorie-dense, so moderation is key. You don't need much to get the benefits. Here's a tip I give my patients. Don't rely on just one type of nut or seed. Mix them. Almonds bring vitamin E, walnuts add omega-3s, sunflower seeds supply zinc. Together they form a nutrient symphony, offering your eyes broad-spectrum protection that no single nut can provide on its own. Now let me ask you, if replacing a bowl of chips or a sleeve of cookies with a handful of mixed nuts could keep your eyes stronger, your blood sugar steadier, and your heart healthier, isn't that a trade worth making? It's a small habit with a ripple effect across your entire body. When it comes down to it, nuts and seeds aren't just snacks. They're one of the simplest daily habits you can adopt to protect your eyesight and your overall health. For older adults who want to stay independent and enjoy clear vision for years to come, that's a swap well worth making. So let's wrap this up. We've talked about the 5 superfoods that can make a real difference for your eyes after 60. Leafy greens that act like natural sunglasses. Fatty fish that supply the omega-3s your retina depends on. Berries that fight off oxidative stress like a tiny army of protectors. Eggs that deliver powerful antioxidants in the most absorbable form. And nuts and seeds, the tiny giants, packed with vitamin E, minerals, and healthy fats your vision craves. Now here's the big takeaway I want you to remember. Blurry vision after 60 is not inevitable. Yes, aging changes the eyes, but you are not powerless. The foods you choose every single day can either speed up the decline or slow it down, sometimes dramatically. I've seen it with my own patients, and the science backs it up. Protecting your eyesight isn't about waiting for a prescription or a surgery. It's about making small, consistent choices that add up to years of sharper, clearer vision. So let me leave you with one simple question. If changing just a few things on your plate could help you keep reading, driving, and seeing the faces you love, isn't that worth it? Thank you so much for watching. If you found this video helpful, do me a favor, hit that like button, share it with someone who could use the information, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. We've got more eye-opening tips and practical health advice on the way, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Until then, take care of yourself, take care of your eyes, and I'll see you in the next video.